I got a new book for my birthday, 30 years old, and the book is called Jazz in the 1970s, Diverging Streams by, the author is Bill Shoemaker. And this is for the younger people who miss the golden age of jazz and have to put up with this 1970s stuff. No, there was a lot of good stuff in 1970s because I enjoyed some of this, what I'm reading. So what he's done for the 1970s is given each year a chapter, and so this is chapter 7 and it's 1976. And the chapter is called Wild Flowers. It is a story repeated in US cities over the past 60 years. Commercial and light industrial properties and their surrounding neighbourhoods fall into decline for various reasons. Everything from the demise of small manufacturing operations to the dispersion of ethnic communities. Artists needing low-cost studio and rehearsal spaces move into abandoned factories, warehouses and office buildings, residing in violation of zoning codes and coining the term loft for a combined living and workspace. A few storefronts became galleries and performance venues presenting cutting-edge work. The bars and greasy spoons gain a new clientele. When the arts reach critical mass, media identifies the area as the seeding of the new, triggering gentrification. Within a few years, real estate developers and their backers have taken over. Buildings are rehabited, rents skyrocket, and more often than not, the artist homesteaders, the old-timers and the vitality of the neighbourhood are squeezed out. Beginning in the mid-1950s, lofts in fading Manhattan neighbourhoods and commercial districts played consequential roles in New York's jazz scene, providing congenial settings for networking and jamming, as well as mingling with their counterparts in the visual arts and literary arts. The decade-long association between Steve Lacy and Mal Waldron began at artists and amateur saxophonist Larry Rivers' East 13th Street loft in 1958. Shortly before the soprano saxophonist and pianist recorded Reflections, Lacy's groundbreaking album of Thelonious Monk's compositions. And that's an absolutely brilliant recording if you want to hear it. I'd highly recommend it. It's really good. Lacy held sessions in his own loft in a former Bowery plastic bag factory, with Billy Higgins playing pieces of luggage in lieu of a kit, and Sonny Rollins occasionally dropping in during his retirement from 1959 to 1961. Lacy's place was on the Saxophone Colossus's way to and from the Williamsburg Bridge, then the mystery-surrounded location of Rollins' legendary shedding. That's where he used to go to practice, if you don't understand what that's all about. Because I guess he couldn't practice in his own place, so he had to go somewhere where he wouldn't disturb anybody. So he went to this bridge and practiced there. I think it was a train bridge with a passenger walkway at the side. Anyway, contemporaneously, painter David X. Young's 3-floor loft in the Flower District of the 28th Street and 6th Avenue had become an around-the-clock meeting place for a wide swathe of modernists and mainstreamers, including trombonist Bob Brookmeyer, saxophonist Zoot Sims, and guitarist Jim Hall. A drinking buddy of fellow abstract expressionists Willem de Kooning and Franz Klein at the Cellar Bar, Young increasingly immersed himself in the jazz scene, creating covers for Prestige in 10-inch albums by, among others, Miles Davis, Modern Jazz Quartet, and guitarist Jimmy Rainey. From the mid-1950s until the mid-1960s, Young's Loft was frequented by everyone from saxophonist and original Austin High School gang member Bud Freeman. And for those who don't know, the Austin High School gang were Bix by the Bex crowd. Bud Freeman to Thelonious Monk, who through the auspices of arranger Hall Ovington, an early regular at Young's, used the Loft to rehearse the ensemble for the pianist's historic 1959 Town Hall concert. Vibraphonist and Prestige producer Teddy Charles was another of the regulars. In 1955, he brought Davis and Charles Mingus to the Loft to refine the sound of Davis's Blue Moods, which I think is a LP that I haven't heard it yet. It was at Young's that the bassist received a telephone call from Baroness Pananika de Koenigswarter informing him of Charlie Parker's death in her apartment that night. Unlike most lofts of the period, the scene at Young's Loft is extensively documented, not only by his own paintings and sketches, but also by photographs and recordings made by Young and the photographer W. Eugene Smith, who rented a floor from Young beginning in 1957. Smith alone took approximately 40,000 photographs and recorded over 4,000 hours of music. A mere fraction of this output has been published in retrospective volumes combining text, images and sound recordings. And they are David X. Young's Jazz Loft and Sam Stevenson's The Jazz Loft Project, photographs and tapes by W. Eugene Smith from 821 6th Avenue, 1957 to 1965. However, this mass of media does not offer a definitive answer as to why such a confluence of artistic energies occurred. There are many factors too numerous to go into here, why it was able to come about, and why it was unlikely to ever happen again, Young concludes in his 2000-year text for the collection bearing his name. Actually, there is only one reason lofts sprang up and closed down: the real estate market. That is why the heyday of downtown jazz lofts began in the mid-1960s, when a failed plan for an expressway left a surplus of empty buildings in Soho. Soho is a very famous place in London, and there are a lot of cities that have the name area Soho based on London, but New York isn't one of those. It's got its own reason. In fact, the name Soho in London, nobody knows where it's come from. The most popular version is that it was a hunting cry of a famous duke or something, but that's just ridiculous. Unless he went to see his ladies of the night, and that was his hunting cry for them. So anyway, so this was in Soho, and later on they talk about, and Soho is derived from South Houston, so SO from South and HO from Houston Street, so it's the area south of Houston Street. And there's an area called NoHo, which is north of Houston Street. This attracted artists of various stripes: photorealist, portrait painter Chuck Close, Dwayne Hanson, who made life-size sculptures of garish, overweight Middle Americans from resin, fiberglass and fabric, and Vito Acconci, who transformed masturbation into a performance art. A similarly diverse array of composers moved into Soho, spanning minimalists like Philip Glass, the Beyond category Laurie Anderson, and the jazz avant-gardists like Ornette Coleman. Subsequently, Soho became ground zero for not only loft jazz, but for the new music as well. The saxophonist was part of a group that brought the seven-story building at 131 Prince Street in '68. Coleman ended up with 3 floors, each a vast 3,500 square feet, more than 50% larger than most American single-family homes at the time, divided only by 6 enormous wood pillars. The renovation was lengthy. When Swing Journal editor-in-chief Kiyoshi Koyama visited Coleman at Prince Street in the summer of '69, he reported that Coleman's 3rd floor living space was still mid-renovation, though essentials like a sauna and a 9-foot pool table were already installed. The ground floor rehearsal and performance space was still raw when Val Wilmer photographed a relaxed moment during a Coleman Quartet rehearsal in May 1971, which French Hayes Edward and Catherine Watley, in their details-rich Ornette at Prince Street, a glimpse from the archives, called a memorable image not only because it seemed to capture the warmth and commiseration of the man's working relationship, but also because it seemed to imply a link between that collaborative spirit and the setting, as though the relaxed intensity was engendered by, or flourished in, the stark, open atmosphere of a prototypical loft, airy and unadorned. By then, Coleman had already been given informal, even impromptu performances at Prince Street for more than a year, but it would be a stretch to call them public. Rather, they were what Edwards and Watley called an underground coterie, lesser public than a loose-knit personal and professional network that came together for performances only open to those in the know. A 1970 Valentine's Day Quartet performance was released in 1972 as Friends and Neighbours, Ornette Live at Prince Street, on Bob Thiel's Flying Dutchman label. Like any album by an important figure like Coleman, Friends and Neighbours has an enhanced documentary stature. However, the lasting resonance of the album does not emanate exclusively from the music, for which there is no resounding critical endorsements, even among Coleman biographers John Whitweiler and John Nicholas Wilson. Whitweiler's praise centres on Ned Blackpool's convivial interplay with Coleman, the drummer's New Orleans marching band snare patterns, and his taut, constructed yet ebullient solos. His comments on Coleman are equivocal. Some alto saxophone solos fail to ignite, while others bring the best out of the tandem of Blackwell and bassist Charlie Hayden. I think that's a condemnation of that album. Unimpressed, Wilson enumerates missing innovative aspects of Coleman's musical language: harmolodic, polyphony, sudden tempo changes, dissolution of the beat, concluding that the album is, Altogether a rather drab debut on record of the quartet that regularly appeared with Coleman in the years 1969 to 1973. At the same time, Wilson also understands that Friends and Neighbours has historical significance, not in the specifics of the music, but in Coleman's attempt to create something like a regional music of Soho. In this respect, Coleman was a forerunner of the loft movement that took on great importance for jazz in New York around the middle of the decade. Wilson's suggestion of a new Soho music implicitly inverts the traditional role plays in shaping artistic sensibilities. Granted, the influence of the place on jazz musicians, for whom an itinerant lifestyle was a necessity to play their craft, stands in stark contrast to writers as varied as Emily Dickinson and H.L. Mencken, who remained where they were raised throughout their working lives. Subsequently, there has been historically a dynamic tension between jazz's cosmopolitanism and the tenacity of the regional characteristics, one that identifies with the proliferation of media. Yet by the time Coleman moved into Prince Street, the dynamic had already largely overwritten by the fixation on the new jazz, diminishing the role of the regional characteristics in the music of the 1960s. Because he was a lightning rod of the avant-garde, the detectable Texas roots of Coleman's playing are, when noted at all, heard in the broader context of the blues and its precursors. Even more so than with Coleman, Texas is palpable presence in the playing of tenor saxophonist Dewey Redman, who first played with Coleman in their high school band and then earned his stripes in the bars of Fort Worth's fabled Hot End, where the idiosyncratic Coleman was almost immediately sent packing wherever he sat in, and eventually became Coleman's front-line counterpart in the late 60s to early 70s quartet. Throughout his illustrious career with Coleman, Keith Jarrett's American Quartet, and his own groups, Redman articulates the liberties ushered in by Coleman with Texas fundamentals, a big sound, a robust sense of swing, and a well-timed use of wails, shrieks, and hollers that drive a Saturday night bar crowd wild. In Friends and Neighbours, if Friends and Neighbours is an early bud of Soho jazz regionalisms, it is because the existing vernaculars and the avant-garde sensibilities were successfully grafted onto a new grassroots social context facilitated by lofts like Coleman's. For more than a year, Coleman did not advertise performances, charge admission, operate a bar, or clear the house between sets. Occasionally, passers-by would hear the music and wander in, and were welcomed, but generally attendees were literally friends and neighbours. If anything, listeners were treated to Coleman's generous hospitality, particularly on special occasions like his birthday gig in 1971. This conviviality is potentially conveyed in the first of the album's two versions of the title tune, which at first seems to be atypical for Coleman. Instead of angular phrases that dart in unexpected directions and resolve in surprising ways, Friends and Neighbours is built on a catchy minimalist riff. The music is propelled by a pair of countervailing forces: Hayden's thick, dark sound tethering Blackwell's bouncy groove and Redman's haunted blues phrases, grounding Coleman's frantically bowed violin. On the first version, the audience sings lyrics like "Friends and neighbours, that's what it's at. Friends and neighbours, that's the fact," with the glee of the double-dutching kids. There have been sing-songy strains in Coleman's music since its beginning, and Coleman employs this type of material and a similar ensemble approach to astonishing ends, even for Coleman, on Dancing in Your Head, the 1977 debut of the electric group known as Prime Time. But a hootenanny-like audience participation on Friends and Neighbours signals the presence of the community from whom Loft Jazz would be their folk music. Thiel's lineup photograph... Oh, I think I'll stop there. Rather long. No, I'll just carry on and finish it off. Thiel's liner photographs for Friends and Neighbours provide further insight into the Prince Street scene. The quartet plays facing each other in a circle, with Coleman seated cross-legged on the speaker cabinet. About a dozen people, with the possible exception of a young boy in his mum's lap, attentively listen. Luminaries like Gil Evans and Pharaoh Saunders mingle. Coleman's minor bird's cage is festooned with a sombrero. This vibe would continue for a while after Coleman dubbed the performance space Artist House early in 1972 and began presenting other musicians, advertising the gigs in the Village Voice and charging admission. By the mid-70s, however, some of Coleman's friends and neighbours became complainants, irked by the round-the-clock music leaking through the building and empowered by zoning codes not in place when Coleman first arrived. Other shareholders in the building, undoubtedly motivated by the performance space's potential drag on their investment in a market poised to boom, first forced Coleman to close Artist House and eventually to sell his loft. Development in a neighbourhood depends on the estimated capacity for specific types of housing, commerce and services, a process in which planning commissions play a determinative role. This was the case in the second half of the 60s, when multi-instrumentalist Sam Rivers, whom I also like, is very nice, well, not nice, but he's a very exciting player, started looking for sites in Harlem where he could run a studio for performing and teaching. Loft living was not yet on his radar. When he finally found a vacant building, Rivers went to the Planning Commission, thinking his application would be embraced. To his surprise, he was turned down, because plans for an arts centre were then being drawn, and Rivers represented competition to connected, moneyed interests. In 1970, Rivers finally found rehearsal space at PS 92 in Harlem, but he was unable to fully realise his vision there. Rivers' search continued until 1972, when he found a 6-storey building at 24 Bond Street in NoHo. I told you about NoHo. Built in 1920. The building was owned by Virginia Admiral, the painter, writer and advocate of low-cost housing for artists in the 1960s. Upon hearing his music, Admiral rented Rivers the basement and ground floor at an exceptionally low rate. It was only after the Rivers family moved in that he found out that Admiral was also the mother of actor Robert De Niro. Rivers then set about transforming the wide-open basement into a performance and rehearsal space. With only occasional help, Rivers made extensive renovations to the extraordinarily high-ceilinged ground floor when he moved the performance space upstairs, building a stage, installing a lavatory for concert goers, and constructing living space lofts. But initially, Rivers needed only to wrap the basement stage area with sound-absorbing burlap, rig a greenish-grey parachute to hide the overhead pipes and joists, and cover the floor with rugs and carpets to open Studio Rivbea in June. As was initially the case with Coleman's Prince Street loft, one had to be in the know to know when performances were on at Rivbea. There was no exterior signage, and publicity consisted of posters put on the surrounding streets and flyers left at shops like Happy Tunes Records in Greenwich Village. Seating consisted of folding chairs and large rugs. There was no admission charge, though donations for the musicians were all but expected. And there was no bar. Instead, juices, fruit and other food were occasionally laid out on the table. But most importantly, having the music in the basement meant no complaints from the neighbours, which was fatal to Artist House. However, the best thing Studio Rivbea had going for it was Sam Rivers. As I say, I really like Sam Rivers. I don't think I've heard an awful lot of him, but what I have heard I've liked. Anyway, that was rather a long reading, and I got tired halfway through that. So if anybody gets to the end of it, I'll be very surprised.